In the scholarly works of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, the link with Western Europe, with Western European thought, has been neglected. Among some exceptions are the pioneering works of Vasil Shturat and a bold attempt by a young historian in Soviet Ukraine, Zinovy Hurevich, who tried to connect this modern Ukrainian political organization with the political thought and political programs, revolutionary programs in Western Europe. His work under the title, very clear title, Молода Україна, appeared in Kharkiv in 1928, but in view of the sharp turn in Soviet politics at the end of the 1920s, the monograph was declared nationalistic, and the fate of the historian, of his mentor, and also of the work was sealed. There is one copy of Молода Україна on this continent, and that is at Harvard. And obviously, I had the opportunity to examine it. Not too many people have. In the post-World War II period, the Canadian literary scholar George Lutsky also chose the same title for his work on the Brotherhood of Cyril and Methodius, Young Ukraine. But in spite of this very promising title, at least promising from my point of view, from my research, he follows the traditional way of looking at the society by focusing primarily on East European local roots. Partly because of ideological constraints, and partly because of sloppy, just plain sloppy scholarship, Young Europe's ideological influence on the Brotherhood has been largely overlooked, even in more recent studies. As an example, I'd like to cite Stefan Kozak's monograph, Ukraińcy Spiskowcy, Bractwo Cyryla i Metodiego, published in Warsaw in 1990, in which the author acknowledges the existence of a striking similarity between Young Europe's ideals and the principles guiding the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, yet he dismisses this connection by stating that it was not Young Europe's impact, but rather the influence of Stowarzyszenie Ludu Polskiego that was responsible for this connection. Obviously, the author is ignorant of the fact that Stowarzyszenie was a cover name for Young Poland, part of Young Europe, a detail that can be found not only in the archives, but also in all major studies on Young Poland. The main objective of my presentation is to trace the roots through which ideas of Young Europe's political program were channeled to Imperial Russia, and show how some of these ideas are reflected, can be detected in the poetry of Shevchenko. And when there was a talk about Caucasus, the program of Young Europe, that is reflected in Shevchenko's poetry, or vice versa, from my point of view. To begin with, briefly, what was Young Europe? It represented a revolutionary international organization that was founded in Switzerland in 1834 by the Italian political theoretician and thinker Giuseppe Mazzini. It consisted of autonomous national units, firmly committed to the struggle for the liberation of all nationalities, irrespective of whether they were small or large, historical or non-historical. According to the Pact of Brotherhood, the name of an agreement signed by the founding members, of young Europe, among them young Italy and young Poland. They were really central to the organization. It was stated that all nations were equal and in their national development, and that their national development, in particular their culture, could be best preserved and prosper in an independent state founded on democratic principles. In other words, the chief purpose for independence of a nationality was to preserve and, so to speak, reinforce the growth of its culture. To achieve this objective, the organization's goal was to bring down the two principal centers of reaction and oppression, the Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire. In subsequent decades, young Europe was joined by a series of national groups, which for reasons of safety chose different designations for the organization's local branches, such as the already mentioned Stowarzyszenie Ukraińskiego, for young Poland, Ruskie Kolo, for Ukrainians or Rusins in Galicia, and this is a topic that I have already discussed at other forums, Wzajemność for the Slovak counterpart, and a decade later we could also count the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood. And here what I want to point out that the organization's chief goal was to destroy the imperial states, the empires, and bring about independence of all nations. They took very seriously the Polish slogan, za waszą i naszą wolność, but this was not only for the historical nations, but of all nationalities that desired to gain independence. One could ask, why were the founders of Young Europe interested in Ukraine? As I have mentioned, the central role in the organization was in the hands of the Italians and also the Poles. Briefly, after a number of unsuccessful uprisings in the West, Mazzini lost confidence in the ability of the Italians and of the Germans to take the initiative for the political regeneration of Europe. And as a result, especially after the Polish uprising of 1831, the November uprising, he looked up to the Slavic peoples, especially the Poles, as the future leaders of the anticipated national liberation movement in Europe. As early as his first major political statement, Fede e Avvenire, published in France, not in Italian first because it was meant for the international collective, Mazzini spoke glowingly not only of the revolutionary heroism of the Poles. Polish revolutionaries, emigres were his closest associates, but also of the national revolution in 17th century Ukraine led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky, who singles out, calling attention to the potential revolutionary force that existed among the people in that part of Europe if the love of freedom could be once again rekindled, as it has been recently on Maidan. Because Ukraine, unlike Russia or Poland, the argument continued, never expressed a desire to dominate over other nations, Mazzini wrote and thought that Ukraine had all the potential or prerequisites to become the leader of a movement striving toward the establishment of a political community of peoples where there would be no men nor nation kings. And this was written in, well, more than 10 years before Knehabetia. No men nor nation kings was a Mazzinian idea for the future regeneration of democratic Europe. From this perspective, it was assumed Ukraine would first unify the Slavic nations, and this in turn would provide the spark for the regeneration of Europe. So, in other words, it is nationalism, but it is nationalism strictly for the freedom of all nations, and this nationalism was viewed from global perspective. Not only European, in fact, it was viewed from global perspective, and I'm so happy that Vitaly introduced this idea this morning. It should be noted that Fede Avenire appeared in France and in French more than a decade before Knyhabetia. The similarity of thought in the two programmatic statements, that is between Fede Avenire and Knyhabetia, is so striking that it needs no further comment. The Italian thinker's designation of Ukraine as the possible leader of a democratic national upheaval in Europe can be explained by the fact that from the early 1830s, as I have noted, his closest associates were Polish emigres, the participants in the November uprisings, among them individuals very close to the poets, to the writers of the Ukrainian School of Polish Literature, plus youthful patriotic revolutionaries like Szymon Konarski, who was the editor of Polish emigre journals, full notes, and he collaborated also with other, even more radical journals, radical emigre journals. It will be Konarski who will become the future leader of the aforementioned Stowarzyszenie Ludu Polskiego in Galicia, as well as in the western territories of the Russian Empire in the second half of the 1830s. And here I want to point out that as far as the national intelligentsia is concerned, it is influenced by the same ideas that are coming from Western Europe. What helped to seal the friendship between the Italian and the Polish emigres was Mazzini's profound love for literature, as I have noted. He began as a literary person as a very young man and became devoted to the unification and independence of Italian lands. Remember that two of the richest and most important northern provinces of Italy were part of the Austrian Empire at this time. So this is where Galicia becomes very important to him. And it was necessary to destroy the Austrian Empire in order to bring about the freedom of all nations. But Austria and the Austrian Emperor and the Russian Emperor, as well as their police, were working hand in hand. So of course, all, or rather both, imperial powers had to be destroyed. Intensive work to prepare the ground for a revolutionary upheaval in the territory of both empires was worked out under the guidance of the Polish historian, the leader of the democratic movement, Joachim Lelewel. And the implementation of this plan was placed in the hands of Konarski. Konarski's preparatory work for an insurrection was to be reinforced by the dissemination of revolutionary books sent from a special library that was organized by Mazzini, Bibliothèque du Proscrit, founded by Young Europe. The books, and also not only founded but also administered by members of Young Europe. The books were channeled to the Austrian and the Russian empires through the ports of Odessa for the south, for Dorpat or Tartu for the north and the Baltic, and by the land route through an underground railway running through Prague, Budapest, Lviv, and from Lviv and Odessa, this incendiary literature was smuggled to Kyiv under the supervision of the Polish veteran of the November uprising, Ignacy Grzegota Kuczynski, one of Konarski's closest associates. Ukrainian seminarians and students participated actively in these underground transactions. Konarsky began his work in 1836, passing through Krakow and Lviv, and after crossing the Austro-Russian border, he concentrated his attention almost exclusively on Lithuania and Ukraine, paying very close attention to the students at the University of Kiev, in particular on Ukrainians, because they represented the largest nationality in Eastern Europe. And that was the plan of Young Europe, and that became the plan of Young Poland as well. The situation changed drastically from the plans of the Polish revolutionaries before 1830. Another channel of Young Europe's influence in the Russian-held territories, as noted earlier, came to the Baltic port of Dorpat, or Turkey, where a large contingent of Poles were studying at the university. In view of the city's important location in the north, it would become the main conduit for revolutionary literature, not only for the revolutionary cell, in other words, Stowarzyszenie or Young Poland at the university, but also for the organization's branches in Lithuania, Belarus, and the Russian capital. It is known that Konarsky, always under very elaborate disguise, his reddish hair and his reddish mustache was always painted jet black. It is known that he visited St. Petersburg at least twice during the 2 years of his very feverish revolutionary activity, focusing there on students, intelligentsia, and also Polish officers, trusted Polish officers in the Russian army. Among the leading activists recruited to Stowarzyszenie at the University of Dorpat were Bronisław Zaleski and Edward Zerigowski, two names well known to Shevchenko's biographers. Both Polish activists, among many others, were arrested and deported to Siberia after Konarsky's organization was uncovered in 1838. Was it only a coincidence that both Zerigowski and Zaleski nurtured on the ideals of Young Europe would become Shevchenko's closest friends during his exile in Siberia? This aspect has not been examined by Shevchenko's biographers. What was the background of these two Polish young men? At this juncture, I'd like to turn to Shevchenko's well-known autobiographical sketch, Hudожnik. Circumstantial evidence suggests that it was precisely during the wave of sweeping arrests and intensive police searches in St. Petersburg, that is, in the aftermath of Konarsky's arrest and his execution, that the Ukrainian artist and poet extended a helping hand to a young Pole by offering him a room in St. Petersburg apartment. It is more than likely that this well-educated and highly idealistic youth, whose spiritual guides, we learn from Shevchenko's narrative, were Mickiewicz and Lelevel, as I have noted, two pillars of Young Poland. It is very possible that the young man may have been searching for a safe haven in order to evade the incentive searches of the police. If we examine the narrative more closely, we learn that this temporary guest lodger did have his own quarters in which he kept his library, and it was there, while visiting the dying Polish artist, that Shevchenko found the works of the two above-named Polish authors. Whether Dembski was a real person or a composite based on Shevchenko's Polish acquaintances in the Russian capital is not important. What really matters is the fact that in St. Petersburg, Shevchenko had contacts with Polish intellectuals who were inspired by the democratic ideals of young Poland. These contacts may serve as an explanation, or actually not may, but do serve as an explanation for the fact that Shevchenko, upon his arrival in Kyiv, according to the testimony of all his colleagues in the Cyril-Methodius Brotherhood, was fully prepared to join the organization. Ideologically, he was fully prepared. This fact is readily accepted by Shevchenko's biographers, but it's never fully investigated. It has not been investigated. Why? Why was he prepared? What were the reasons for it? Zaitsev, in his biography, notes that Shevchenko was familiar with Polish emigre journals, like Kosmas, that he was familiar with the ideas of Mazzini and Garibaldi. Well, Garibaldi was not an ideologue, he was a soldier. And he notes that he was familiar with New Europe. Obviously, he's thinking of young Europe. There was no such organization as New Europe. And this is just to show you the superficiality of this aspect in the studies of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood and at the same time of Shevchenko. Now let's look at the influence of young Europe in Kyiv. We are transferred from St. Petersburg to Kyiv. By 1840, the core of the leadership of the Konarsky conspiracy was crushed. Some of the activists were executed, like Konarsky, 5 were executed, others were recruited, and many of them served in the Caucasus. Among them who were 2 Ukrainians from the University of Kyiv. They held a very important role, played a very important role in Stowarzyszenie, in the Kyiv branch of Stowarzyszenie. They were the soldiers. In other words, their role was the role of a soldiers, which meant that they were responsible for recruitment. And obviously, they would be concentrating primarily on Ukrainians. So there were Ukrainians, we don't know how many, who were influenced by these ideas. It is of interest to note that Mykola Hulak, the architect of the organization of Cyril Methodius, studied law at the University of Dorpat, and that the historian Mikhail Lunin, after graduating from the same institution, from the University of Dorpat, assumed a teaching position at the University of Kharkiv, where he became the mentor for Mykola Kostum, leading members of the society. We also know of the close relationship between Kulish and the Polish literary figure, already mentioned, I think yesterday, Michał Grabowski, who was interrogated in connection with the Konarsky trials. And I don't think this has been mentioned in Ukrainian literature. Kulish and Kostomaro were on very good terms with the Polish historian Swidzinski, whose ties to people closely connected to young Europe can be very easily established. During the police interrogation, some members of the society openly admitted that their organization has had roots in the Konarsky movement. I believe it was Andruski who speaks of that. Now let's look briefly at Shevchenko, because that is our main theme. We know that the life of the society was brief. The Tsarist police liquidated it at the end of March of 1847. with the arrest of its leading members. The significance for the Ukrainian national renaissance, most scholars do agree, was enormous, for it was instrumental in transforming what has been primarily a cultural national movement in previous decades into a fully fledged political organization with a clearly defined program and clearly defined objectives. And here, if we would like to distinguish between Narodny poet, something that was discussed this morning, people's poet, and the national poet, the difference is that a people's poet would be someone who would write poems like Sadok Vishnevy, Kolokha, and that. But in Shevchenko, we have a national poet who is in favor of national independence of Ukraine. It is he who spoke, This is a political objective, based on the ideology of young Europe. We do know that Shevchenko received the harshest sentence of all the members, primarily because of the political content of his work. The poet's writings, including the freshly prepared manuscript about the 15th century Czech national hero, Jan Hus, or Heretic, were confiscated and remained under police law until 1906. Fortunately for posterity, copies of large sections of the poem, including the dedication for the Czech scholar Shevchenko, were carefully hidden in homes of the poet's friends and admirers. Upon release in 1857, the first task that the poet set before himself was to recover the full text of Jan Hus. Both the author and his close colleagues at the Society Brotherhood considered this one of his finest works. Vasily Bilozersky penned down his thoughts on this subject. Upon hearing the rapturous report of Shevchenko's reading of Jan Hus, Bilozersky was not present, but it was related to him by other members of the society. Bilozersky wrote, "In an instant, a salutary thought flashed through my mind. What a genius we possess in the person of Taras Hryhorovych. Because only a genius, through a deep emotional insight, is capable to grasp the needs of the people and of his entire era." And we do know from other sources, including from the informer Petrov, that whatever was discussed at the table, whatever was discussed by the members of the society, was immediately transformed into a poem. And obviously Jan Hus would be one of them. Shevchenko portrays Jan Hus as first and foremost a national hero, a patriot defending the rights of the Czech nation against the aggressive designs of the Germans on his land. It was not too difficult for the police investigators in St. Petersburg to figure out that the loathsome portrait of the Pope painted by the poet, Shevchenko was depicting the Russian Tsar, and that his description of the prelate's contemptible German underlings, he was speaking of the Russian imperial bureaucrats bent on strengthening their grip on Ukraine. In Jan Hus, however, one would search in vain for a hint of a mythical, benign Tsar, an element central to Russian Slavophiles with whom the Ukrainian poet had close, friendly relations. Neither does Shevchenko's Slavophilism in the an idea that runs like a red thread through the poem, in particular in the dedication to Shevchenko, has anything to do or has anything in common with Alexander Pushkin's notion of Slavic unity, a union which, from the perspective of the Russian poet, was to be forged by a strong hand like Peter I or today Putin. Elevating Jan Hus as a model of Slavs, model to follow, Shevchenko formulates his Slavophile ideas strictly on the basis of a free association of equal nations. This is the program of Young Europe. Free association of equal nations bonded together by the Christian idea of brotherly love. Mazzini's program and Young Europe's program did include the question of religion in the sense of the basic moral principles of Christianity, but it did not have to be Christianity because, as I mentioned, his program contained a global perspective. He was equally reverential toward Hinduism, Buddhism. In fact, he was influenced partly by Buddhism. So equality for all religions, but religion was important as a factor of moral guidance. This concept, as noted earlier, represented the cornerstone of Young Europe's ideology, embodied in the organization charter known as Pact of Brotherhood. This idea was also the founding block on which the program of the youngest child of Young Europe, as I would call it, the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, was based. In the dedication of the poem, Shevchenko eulogizes Shevchenko as a Slavic philosopher who emulated Jan Hus, rescued Slavdom from being consumed by the German quagmire. At the end of the dedication, the poet expresses an ardent wish that all Slavs become brothers, brothers firmly united on the principles of equality, while fighting for justice and truth, treading in the footsteps of the Czech martyr, even at the price of becoming branded heretics, or even at the price of their life. A brief excerpt. Щоб усі слов'яни стали добрими братами, і синами сонця правди, і єретиками, отакими, як Константський єретик великий, мир мирові подарують і славу вовіки. Even though the last stanza of the poem contains a vivid description of the Czech martyr's execution by fire, being guided by the ideological principles enunciated in the romantically inspired thought of Young Europe, the author does not conclude his poem in a minor key. On the contrary, the last stanza issues a note of warning to the pompous prelates of the papal curia, an obvious allusion to the Tsarist officialdom in Ukraine, that while those in power were celebrating victory, above their heads hovered a menacing specter, the mace of the celebrated Hussite soldier Jan Žižka. Постривайте, он над головами, старий Žižka з Таборова махнув булавою. A decade earlier, Poland's activists in Young Poland, or Stowarzyszenie, Leslaw Lukasiewicz, did send a manuscript, a Czech manuscript, to his colleagues in Paris, to Bogdan Zaleski and to Mickiewicz, hoping that they would write a work in Polish on that subject. So far, I have not come across that, and I would like to ask our specialist on Mickiewicz whether this work indeed became a reality. Today, there are at least 5 translations of Shevchenko's Jan Hus in Czech language alone. The first translation of the dedication to Shevchenko was made by a Czech poet, a prominent emigre political activist in Young Europe, Josef Václav Frič, who not only saw to it that the translation would be promptly published, the translation of Jan Hus, but immediately began to work on a drama in verse and the subject of Ivan Mazepa, the symbol of struggle for Ukraine's independence. By no means could these works be categorized as examples of Slavic literary awakening or Slavic literary reciprocity. This was a well thought out, well orchestrated political effort designed to bring about, through the instrument of literature, the revolutionary upheaval envisioned by the founders of Young Europe. Thank you.